Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. We'll just wait a moment or two so that other attendees can also join, and then we'll get started. Okay. So we're right at the top of the hour now, so why don't we go ahead and get started. So again, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining this webinar on plain language summaries of publications. It's a new area, a new way of sharing results. And today we hope to share with you some insights on what they are, how they're different from other similar types of communications, and how to create one. This recording will be made available afterwards, so hopefully you can tap back into it at that point. If you do have any questions, please do share them. We will at the end look to address any of the questions that are sent through. There is the Q&A function, so please go in there and share any questions that you might have. So as I said, for our agenda today, we'll talk about what these PLSP are and really importantly, why they are emerging as an important area of sharing results. And then we'll take a look at how to do this. So we'll take a look at sort of 4 different stages from the initial conception stage all the way out to dissemination phase when it's in the hands of the readers, so to speak. And then we'll have that facilitated discussion with our panelists, as well as answering any questions that folks have submitted in the Q&A box. We do have what I'd like to say, a distinguished panel today. As you can see, it's a diverse group, different stakeholders who have various roles in the conception, development, and dissemination of PLSP. So each of these folks will give a quick introduction of themselves as we go along, but I'm sure that they will provide really extraordinary insights for everybody. So really quickly, we would like to launch our initial poll. This poll is just getting a sense of the audience's experience and background, experience with PLSP specifically. So if you can go ahead and answer these questions, that'll be great. And in the meantime, we'll take a look at our disclosure slide here. All right. So why don't we move forward and we'll see the results of the poll, and we'll address those as soon as we have them. But what I'd like to do now is pass it off to Kim Edwards, and she will take us away.
Thanks, Vaitosh, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Again, my name is Kim Edwards. I just saw the poll results come in, Vaitosh. Do you want to go over those first before we dive in?
Sure, very quickly. It looks like mostly we have folks from industry, which is wonderful. You folks are the ones who require the activation energy and the investment of resources to put this in. But actually, now that I'm looking at it more closely, half of the folks are medical writers and those from scientific communications agencies. So you also play obviously a critically important role. There are some folks from patient advocacy as well, which is wonderful. Even we have medical centers or academic centers represented as well, and medical journals. So a couple of other folks mixed in there, but we're really glad to have you, and we think that you are absolutely the audience, the target audience for this webinar. So as far as experiences go, it looks like it's actually spread across. That's a little surprising. We thought there wouldn't be many folks who know much about this, but that's great. All right, so keep that in mind, our panelists. We have some folks who are aware of what PLSP are. So Kim, thank you for that. Please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Vaitosh. So again, Kim Edwards, I'm a senior manager of health communications at SysGrip, and I've had the pleasure of working with all of our speakers today on creating PLSPs. So I'm really excited for everyone to hear from them. But first, because we do have some folks that are completely new to PLSPs, I think it's good just to give a brief overview. So this is an example of one here that was published in Future Oncology. PLSPs are citable peer-reviewed journal articles. They're really a version of the original scientific manuscript written in plain language. So the original can be published in a separate journal other than a Future Science Group journal, or published alongside the PLSP in a Future Science Group journal. PLSPs are considered an acceptable secondary publication per ICMJE guidelines, and Laura will speak more to that in a bit. Ideally, PLSPs should be open access so they have a better chance of actually reaching their intended readership. You have to remember that the target audience likely is not going to have an institution provided subscription to a journal. So we really want to make sure that we're making it as easy as possible for folks to access. So speaking of target audience, our target audience for PLSPs, patient community or study participants, the general public, patient advocacy groups, and also time-limited or non-specialist clinicians. And this can actually be a really valuable resource, I think, for facilitating conversation between clinicians and patients as well. And we just want to note that PLSPs are an emerging new area of health communications. So the thinking around PLSPs is evolving. So checking out resources like the one we listed here may be helpful in the future. And so at this point, I'll turn it over to Sarah, who will walk us through the differences between PLSP and PLS.
Hi, everybody. My name's Sarah Griffiths, and I'm a communication team leader patient engagement team at Oxford Pharmagenesis. So I'm a medical writer, and again, similar to Kim, had the privilege of working with everybody who's involved today on PLSPs. So PLS in general is a very hot topic conversation at the moment, and the definitions of what a PLS, why you should do a PLS, and how you should do a PLS there's lots of information out there, and we're coming to a consensus on what they are and how we should do them. But a PLSP is slightly different, and I've got a table here which just runs through a lot of the points that Kim's just covered, but also some of the differences to what a PLS is itself. So a PLS is a jargon-free précis of a peer-reviewed publication, whereas a PLSP is, as Kim said, is a secondary publication. It's often separate to the main publication itself. A PLS can be in a range of formats. So it could be a short form lay language abstract, and there can be larger, longer documents. So there's infographics. There's quite a range, and there's not a real consensus at the moment. Whereas a PLSP, sorry, I'll just speak up more clearly if you can hear me better. Whereas a PLSP is a typeset document, which are around 4 to 8 pages in length, and those written in line with guidelines. So, for instance, Future Science Group have specified what should be included on these. And they're peer-reviewed, and there's a DOI assigned, whereas a PLS itself can be indexed on PubMed as well to sit under an abstract. The audience, there's a lot of overlap. They're both intended to have a broad audience, particularly a PLS is for a non-technical or time-poor audience, whereas PLSP has a slightly greater focus on a lay readership versus a PLS, but again, it's a grey area, there's lots of overlap. And what's really important that both of them present the science in a clear and concise manner to support inclusivity. In terms of the presentation of them, a PLS is typically associated with the main article, and it can come as supplementary material, and it may not always be open access, although that's ideal. Whereas a PLSP is on its own, and it's typically open access or is found on a sponsor's website or independent platforms. But all of these discoverability and accessibility varies for PLS, whereas PLSP is a relatively new form of publication, such as the one we're talking about today from Group. Again, nomenclature, PLS versus regulatory results summaries. There's lots of differences between those, and I'll run through those quickly so we're all on the same page as to what it exactly is we're talking about. The regulatory summaries are perhaps easier to distinguish. Those are the ones that have got the mandated content, the mandated by the EU, based on the key results of a single clinical study. And they're primarily to inform participants about the trial results. And they have a certain focus, particularly on the primary endpoint, certain secondary endpoints sometimes, and the safety data. And there's a template and certain information that has to be included. And the reading age is typically lower than it would be for a PLS. So we're looking at age 11 to 13 years compared with the PLS, which is slightly higher, around 14 to 18 years. And the text of those is typically jargon free. A trial results summary typically does not have any interpretation. It just talks about what the results were of a clinical trial, whereas PLS tells any interested reader, what does this article say? And that's in a nutshell. So I'll just hand over to a video from one of our patient authors who was involved in the PLSP we've worked on.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, one of the key opportunities that the PLSP presents is having the patient's perspective actually incorporated, as an author. And so Ian was one of the authors on one of the projects here, and he was kind enough to share a recorded message since he is all the way in Australia. So here we go with Ian's message.
Hello everybody, my name is Ian Blue. I'm speaking to you from my home in South Australia. I'd like to thank SysGrip for the invitation to contribute to the webinar. Dr. Kim Edwards asked that I provide a brief overview of my experience as a patient author. I'll provide a short background, explain how I became a patient author, discuss why plain language summary publications are important for patients and the wider community, and provide a few comments about what I've learned from the experience. So how did I come to be a patient author? I was the chair and professor of a nursing program in Canada in 2006 when I was diagnosed with prostate cancer. I subsequently had surgery and then radiation therapy. My cancer was still active, so in 2007 I retired and returned home to Australia. I was very fortunate to come under the care of a very proactive medical oncologist who was monitoring suitable clinical trials for his patients. In 2015, when my cancer was not responding well to the prescribed androgen deprivation therapy, he put my name forward for a large phase 3 multinational trial of a new drug to combat non-metastatic castration-resistant prostate cancer. I reached the 5-year mark in that trial in 2020. From the early stage of the trial, it was clear I was taking the non-placebo drug as my PSA fell dramatically and has remained very low, a very pleasing outcome for me and my family. In September 2020, a publication about that trial I was a participant in was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. About a month later, in October, I was contacted by Dr. Kim Edwards from SysGrip, and we began the task of creating a PLSP from the original journal article. There were 3 primary authors, the original trial investigator and 2 patient authors. We were really the tip of the iceberg, as there were a large number of team members from SysGrip and a major sponsor of the trial. This process took 5 months and culminated in our PLSP being published in Future Oncology in its online version in February of 2021. A tremendous effort, I think you'll agree, by all concerned. So why are PLSPs important? The generation of new knowledge via research is vital to our ongoing development of new technology and treatment for human health and well-being. I think that's a given. Just as important as knowledge generation is finding effective ways to get that knowledge to those that need it most. New ways have emerged to disseminate knowledge. Ancient cultures, like the one that inhabits the country I live in, transferred their knowledge via storytelling, song and dance and artwork on cave walls. Today we have exciting things such as webinars, podcasts, blogs and social media like Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, but there is a need for authentic, peer-reviewed information in that space. There is also a great need to simplify and make accessible knowledge arising from clinical trials in easy-to-understand formats. As a nurse, I understand the importance of being an advocate for the patients in my care. They needed explanations about their treatment, about their medications, about their pathway back to full health. So for me, making complex and difficult information understandable was a big motivator to be involved with the PLSP. So what have I learned from this experience? Firstly, recruitment of patient authors requires skill and support, especially those who have little or no experience in professional writing or use of technology. Their voice is just as important as those of us who fortunately have those skills. Having a support and development team to initiate, plan and coordinate the process is vital. SysGroup deserves recognition for their work in achieving this end. Multinational entities involved in clinical research are increasingly looking to incorporate patient voices in their post-trial publications. They do this because it will assist in the marketing of new drug classes or new technologies, but also because they've learned including patient experience and feedback encourages participants in clinical trials and assists overall community acceptance of the importance of those trials and research. I have found a lot of personal satisfaction comes from helping others who are experiencing health challenges to better understand their treatment and digest new knowledge that is generated via clinical trials. I would like to encourage more patient authors to step up and be involved in PLSPs. They have unique insights and can make a significant contribution if given encouragement and support. So talk to your health provider, trial coordinator or community health support group about ways to be involved. Your voice is one that is being listened to. Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. Bye now.
So that was our message from Ian Blue, again, a patient and a patient author on a PLSP. We're so appreciative to have his perspective and certainly support the messages that he so eloquently shared. And what we're going to do now is actually just stop the presentation, and we're going to pass it over to Joel Nowak, who is, brings a similar perspective. But Joel, please take over and please share your thoughts.
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. I want to briefly introduce myself. I am a thriver with 5 primary cancers, including metastatic prostate cancer. So I kind of have a little experience about being a patient and the patient perspective. I want to say that for the last 15 years, I have been an advocate and educator, reaching out and working with people who are diagnosed and touched by cancer. So that includes not only the patients, but also their families. I also want to say that I had the great honor of working with Ian, being the patient co-author with him, and it was a terrific opportunity, and I had a chance to get to know him, and I really appreciate it because he contributed so much, along with everybody else on our team. Excuse me. But I, since Ian did such an extraordinary job explaining so much about PLSPs and why they're important, I'm going to actually just spend my comments specifically why these types of documents are so very important to patients and to their clinical care. The thing, or the reality right now, is that when we look at the current state of affairs in medical research and how research gets interpreted in the clinic, we actually have 3 separate and distinct languages going on. Researchers have their own language, clinicians have their own language, but patients really get or know how to speak it or understand any of these languages. The bottom line is that the role of researchers and clinicians is to bring patients cutting-edge treatments delivered in such a way that they support the patient's individual goals and aspirations. These goals are often variable. They can include survival, increasing survival, maintenance of their quality of life, or even extending their ability to carry out a very specific task or job. Increasingly, we see that more and more patients want to take an active role in their healthcare decisions. Patients' ability to be an integral part of their medical decision-making ensures that their own personal goals inform their treatment decisions. Patients' ability to understand or have a translation of the researchers' and clinicians' languages allows them to take the first step towards becoming an active and positive participant in their own healthcare decision-making. Without patients understanding clinical research and the language used to describe the research, they will not be able to become partners in their own care. Patient involvement in their own clinical decision-making leads to better outcomes, increased patient satisfaction, trust in their clinical team, higher patient quality of life, reduced patient anxiety, and less emotional distress. It also fosters a more positive and direct professional communication with positive and lasting effects to a patient's overall well-being. Better understanding of clinical research and clinical treatments allows patients to ask their clinical teams better questions. Better questions lead to better outcomes. Clinical trials are the lifeblood of clinical progress. Without clinical trials, we cannot make progress, and most patients would be willing to participate in research, but first they must trust that the research will not harm them, and it also has the possibility of perhaps helping them. If they cannot understand the language, they often don't have the confidence that the research can provide them with any benefits. If patients understand the language, they'll be able to develop confidence in the research community and then in turn with the clinical community. Patients also want to know the results of their participation in clinical research. If they are offered a plain language translations of research, including the results of the research in which they have participated in, they will be much more open to future participation in other research projects. Although not the direct topic of this panel, I would be remiss not to mention that the language barrier that I reflected on not only affects clinical research, but it's also a major problem in the clinic, where patients are often unable to understand their own medical records. A patient's medical records should instruct the patient along with their clinical teams as to what might be their best clinical decisions as they move through their treatment journeys. Researchers, clinicians, and patients need to be able to communicate with each other. Strong communication can only exist if they all speak the same language. PLSPs are an excellent first step towards accomplishing this goal.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Joel. Really an extraordinary perspective. We would expect nothing less, and I think really highlights the role that PLSP can have in being more patient-centric in clinical research. So some ways to go, but hopefully we can continue changing that with things like PLSP. So we're going to hear from another side of you know, the whole process here. We're going to pass it over to Laura, and she'll tell you what perspective she represents, and I'll pass it right over to her.
Thank you. So hi, everybody. Just to introduce myself, I'm Laura Dormer, and I'm editorial director at the Future Science Group, and we're a publisher of a collection of peer-reviewed journals and specialist websites. So we've been offering various options to our authors for a while now for things like inclusion of a lay abstract in an article, graphical abstracts, summarising the article in an image, and also infographics alongside articles, particularly our clinical trial protocol articles that sort of walk you through the steps of the protocol of a clinical trial. But some time ago, we were approached by some authors because they were interested in publishing a plain language summary of their original research paper. But the journal that they were publishing that paper in didn't at that time, or I believe even currently, have that as an option. So they wanted to find out the possibility of publishing that with us. So that really set us on the path that we've been on now for over 18 months. First of all, looking into the feasibility of that. So we got our sort of the cogs whirring about whether that was even you know, an option for us as a journal. And then once we kind of got over that hurdle and decided that yes, it was definitely something that we wanted to pursue, then getting the program of publishing PLSPs underway with our journals, so as standalone articles across all of our Future Science Group journal portfolio, which I'm pleased to say has been really positively received. I've mentioned to a few people now that, you know, I've worked on a lot of projects over the years that I've worked at Future Science Group, but I don't think that I've had anything that's been received with such enthusiasm and such positivity from the community as something that's really been embraced, something that's really been recognised as an unmet need currently. So that's been really great to be involved with. the outcome of this has been that we've now published 2 standalone PLSPs in our journals, and we have many more in the works, some of them quite near to publication. So there's been a huge amount of uptake of that, which has been really great to see. And I think more generally as a publisher, it's been really great to see the shift towards more patient-centered healthcare over the years that I've been working in publishing. And I think it's so important for patients and other non-specialists as well to have that information when they're making healthcare decisions, for all the reasons that Ian and Joel have very nicely and passionately outlined for you. And I think plain language summaries of publications of that clinical trial research is really crucial for advancing that. So yes, it's a great innovation, I think, and something that I'm really embracing being involved in, and really great to see the impact of that as well on the community. So yeah, thank you for inviting me to speak with you today.
Laura, for working with your organization to be leaders, in this space. It takes all stakeholders to really truly be more patient-centric. So, and thank you for highlighting why it is that you folks, that Future Science Group, started to offer this option to authors. Yeah. So to now hear from the industry perspective, we're going to pass it over first to Jisoo. Please, Jisoo, go ahead.
Everyone, I'm Jisoo Decoders. I head up global advocacy for Daiichi Sankyo in the cancer enterprise. So my focus has always been cancer. And nature of cancer requires patients to learn about their illness, make difficult treatment choices, and cope with side effects of the drugs that are prescribed them. The shift to an outpatient treatment more and more has increased the necessity for good patient education. Since most patients and their caregivers have to deal with the treatment-related problems and adverse effects at home, it's more important that they get the information directly from a scientific perspective. Arming cancer patients with information helps patients make good decisions, prepare them for treatment, and helps them cope with the adverse effects associated with the treatment. It also reduces anxiety and depression and increases satisfaction with their treatment. It improves communication with their family members and improves their quality of life, as Joe and Ian mentioned. Patient education and meeting patients' information needs is a fundamental aspect of patient-centered care. Patient satisfaction has also been associated with improved patient adherence to medical recommendations and overall better outcomes. So this is an important job that we're all doing to help patients get the information that they need. Thank you for asking me to be here.
Thank you so much, Jisoo. So now what we're going to do is we're going to pass it over to Yuan, who is from Bayer, and she will also represent the industry perspective. But for that, we are going to go ahead and go back to the slide deck. So Yuan has a wonderful slide here prepared that she's going to talk through. Please, Yuan, go ahead.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you all for inviting us to this webinar. My name is Yuan Wang, and I'm the publication strategy lead from Bayer. We had the pleasure with working with Joe and Ian as our patient authors on a recent plain language summary publication that we did that was published in Future Oncology. So the experience that we had really speak to what everyone else on the panel had talked about. So I'd just like to echo the importance and the unmet need that this publication of plain language summary could offer. And there's this increased collaboration between patient partners and our sponsorship as pharma companies, as well as with publishers that really are passionate and offering the open access options to publish the paper. And this is really to help expand the potential audience and extend the reach to to patients and general public beyond the scientific community. So this is really key for everybody in the patient community, that they get access to the clinical trial and research data as early as possible, and in a format and a plain language that they can easily understand. So the other importance while we're thinking about this plain language summary publication was really to enhance the trusting working relationship and partnership, as well as fostering the transparency of our clinical trial data to our patient communities, and making sure that they know what those trial results mean to them and how they can utilize those information when they're having discussions with their physicians for the shared decision-making process. And lastly, as a lot of the scientific communication and the data are very complex to understand, and oftentimes, as you will see, in social media or on the news or websites, a lot of these information may not be translated in the most accurate way. So by publishing a plain language summary that's been peer-reviewed by patients and the original authors of the paper, this really help reduce the risk of the information being misinterpreted or misrepresented. So these are all the considerations that we discussed and had aligned with our teams when we did our first plain language summary publication. And I'm very happy to be here with everybody on the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Johan. So, we actually would like to launch another poll at this point, and we sort of want to get the audience engaged in brainstorming the challenges, the barriers that might exist to doing this work. So if we can launch that poll, and in the meantime, I know we would like to keep most of the Q&A discussion at the end, but we do have a couple of questions that came in about which journals are willing to publish PLSP, and are there journals that are publishing full PL manuscripts. So for that, maybe Laura, you can just address that really quick while we have the poll going.
Yeah, sure. So at the moment, as far as I know, the Future Science Group is the only publisher offering these standalone plain language summary publications as a standalone article in their own right. And the reason we do that is as I say, some journals don't have that as an option, even as a supplementary material or anything like that. So that was the reason we kind of kickstarted the project in the first place. But other publishers do offer other plain language options. So many publishers are now allowing authors to include a plain language abstract kind of next to the usual abstract, and that appears usually above the paywall and appears on PubMed and those sorts of places. And many publishers as well will allow plain language content to be included in the supplementary materials. But as far as I know, we're the only ones that are doing them as standalone, so they can be sort of discovered and cited and used in their own right. And the question I think was regarding whether there's just plain language articles full stop, so not perhaps, I presume you mean not perhaps summaries of another article, but just that they are the original. Not that I'm aware of, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's something that that develops over time. Again, it would be down to sort of the individual journals whether they were interested in including those kind of articles. But I think given the desire for more plain language content, I would think that would be something that would develop, but not something I'm aware of at the moment.
And now you did an excellent job of filling in the gap, because now we do have the results of the poll, and it looks like folks have mentioned that lack of awareness of PLSP as a publication option is might be the top barrier. 68% of folks mentioned that, and then followed by that, Laura, to the point that you were just mentioning, few journals are accepting the PLSP, but lack of guidance is another point as well, and resources, time and investment. That's always a challenge. And that actually goes along with having guidance, having some established methodology for doing this. So pretty even distribution on the rest of the questions, and folks, we will be addressing these as we move along here. So we'll actually launch this poll again later to see if your minds have changed about what the challenges are. And hopefully this webinar helps to address that first one about awareness. So now what we're going to do is pass it over back to Gisu. And she's going to talk to us about the beginning stages of working on a PLSP from the concept part. Gisu, I'll pass it over to you. Please take over.
Thank you so much, Betosh. Yes, for those communities, it's so important to define what is the original scientific article, and you have to have a criterion to determine which scientific article will be used for patients and their communities, and it's useful for them. A publication steering committee usually meets to determine the articles of value, and then the appropriate patient community and how best to close the existing gap of knowledge for patients. Since PLSPs are secondary publications, it's important to obtain permission from the original journal as well as the original authors at the minimum. It would be wonderful to identify patient authors such as Ian and Joel, who can lend their voices to the issues faced by patients. But as a minimum, the original lead author is important to include. And then next, the hard task of identifying a journal that accepts PLSPs and has a broad enough readership by the patient community. It's important to mention that the goal of PLSP is to share scientific information in a lay version to patients who may or may not have the scientific background. So it would have to be, we have to overcome the health literacy issues that may exist in the patient communities. So Laura, I don't know if you're going next, but.
Laura, you just spoke about sort of the environment right now and the lack of journals, but maybe you can speak to what Future Sciences is doing to raise awareness about having this option.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, I guess in terms of identifying journals, as I say, as far as I know, we're the only journals offering this at the moment, and I guess webinars like this will really help to get that message out. In terms of sort of thinking about a target journal, something that we always recommend, and I know a lot of other publishers are very keen for people to do, is it's really great for authors, author groups to make a pre-submission inquiry if they're interested in publishing, either in a specific journal or perhaps just more broadly, just to find out what journals might be suitable based on the scope of the PLS that they're working on, or the paper that they're working on. That means that we can sort of advise on the best journal to kind of meet the scope of your paper, and we have sort of author guidelines and so forth for the creation of PLSP and answer any questions that people might have. And I know other publishers are very happy to receive those sorts of queries. And when you're doing that, you can find out, if the information isn't already available on the journal website, what options those publishers have for including plain language content, if they do at all. And what the process is for that. And I think one of the crucial things on our side that I would recommend people find out about is their process for peer review of that content, and also to find out what sort of processes they have for the dissemination of plain language content once it's published. And I know we'll come on to that a little bit later, but it's definitely worth thinking about that up front when you're selecting a journal, so that you know that any efforts that you're putting into creating this plain language content is really going to get out there and reach the audience that you're trying to reach. You don't want to put the effort in without knowing that it's going to find the audience.
Helping us through that part. So now we've covered sort of the concept stage, some of the startup and planning activities, and we're going to move into the actual creation stage. And for that, we're going to stick with Laura. She's going to talk to us here about some of the recommendations that are out there from ICMJE and how she has worked with authors to actually implement those.
Yeah, and I won't go through every single word of this table, but this is sort of a summary of a poster that we had at the recent ISMAP conference. So as I mentioned before, when we first started work on our PLSP plans, the first thing we looked into was simply the feasibility of publishing these as standalone pieces, because it wasn't something that had been done before, and whether there was any existing guidance out there. And as is often the case, we referred to the resources that are created by the ICMJE, which, for those of you that perhaps aren't familiar with that, is the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, which some of you may know is the source of a lot of journals' authorship policies, for example. And they very helpfully also had some recommendations on what they call acceptable secondary publications, which we decided PLSPs qualified for. So I'll just very quickly talk you through some of the points there. So a key feature, as Giza already mentioned, in publishing a standalone PLSP is that both the journals are aware and happy for it to proceed. So the journal that published the original article, if that's not the same place that you're publishing the PLSP, it's important to make sure that they're aware and that they're happy for that to proceed, and also that any embargo requirements are met. So making sure that the original publication, the priority of that is respected. So far, we've not run into any difficulties with that, and I don't think anyone's asked us for an embargo, but that could be established if needed. And sometimes the authors are happy to do that, or else we as a publisher are happy to reach out on their behalf. Obviously, secondary publications are intended for a different audience. That's kind of baked in really with PLSPs. That's the whole point. It's important that they obviously are a faithful reflection of the original information. So that's an important part of our internal review process when we first receive a PLSP, and also the peer review process itself, to make sure that no extra data is included in the PLSP that wasn't included in the original. That's a really sort of crucial point. And finally, it's obviously important that you have full disclosure in the PLSP of the original publication, and include links to it so that it's all nice and transparent, everything links back and forth. And actually rather nicely on PubMed, the articles link up within the PubMed system itself, so you can easily jump between the two, which is great. And I guess just for the final point on the table there, making sure everything's nice and transparent in the title of the publication as well. So just overall making sure that everybody is aware of what's going on, everything is transparent, and that the publication is very clearly what it is a summary of an existing original article. And by ticking off all those points, that's how we've established our process for publishing PLSPs.
Get a little bit more into that process here in a minute, but first we're going to go over to Jaswant, who's going to talk to us about the importance of partnership and collaboration in moving towards having PLSP done. So Jaswant, please enlighten us.
Thank you, Betash. And just as a brief introduction, my name is Jaswant Dar. I'm head of publications and medical inquiries here at Bayer Oncology. Yuan had mentioned earlier that we recently published a PLSP, and this slide essentially depicts the approach or best practice for that case example. So, we are committed to partnering with patients across the entire value chain. So that includes data generation, data dissemination, education, policy and access, and of course, this publications as well. And here, I would like to bring your attention to the green box below, where we have several forums where we leverage the insights directly from patients through ad boards, patient summit meetings, and we specifically ask questions on formats for PLS, topics of interest, and so on. And so we bring that into our strategy team meetings, and so that is I would say a best practice on how we approach that PLSP. So of course, happy to answer any questions on this this topic. So Betash, I think we can probably move to the next slide.
So in keeping with the idea of teamwork, now we're going to go ahead and have Kim walk us through a little bit about the different roles that might be involved in developing a PLSP.
Yeah, so it really is a collaborative team effort to create a PLSP. So I'll just, as a case study, walk through sort of the steps that we took. So SysGroup can take care of all the project management. OPG took care of all the scientific writing and editing, along with SysGroup's plain language editor. They go back and forth and also collaborate on design ideas for easy to understand graphics that might be implemented. It's obviously, if you just click next, Betash, thank you. It's obviously a really collaborative effort in the review process. So primarily between the authors and responsible parties on the sponsors end to really make sure that the content is accurate and consistent among the original article and the PLSP. It's also a collaborative effort with our editorial panel of representative users who review the PLSP for understandability. So This editorial panel is an external panel made up of patients, patient advocates, members of the general public, who really sort of represent our target audience and can highlight some areas of possible confusion that we might have overlooked. And then lastly, of course, peer review once the PLSP is submitted to the target journal and before it can be accepted. And finally, Future Science Group takes care of graphic design and final layout. So
stay with Kim, and she's going to walk us through a little bit, a lot more detailed in terms of the process. But for folks who maybe didn't catch that, OPG is Oxford Pharmacogenesis,
yes,
where Sarah is from. So I think the point there is that you do need, your traditional medical regulatory writers still, because that's very important.
Thank you, Betosh, talking too fast. So we thought it might be helpful, again, sort of as a case study to show sort of a really high level chronological order of the steps we took. So of course you want to get your permissions in place, as Laura already touched on. But once all of those logistics are in place, we'll receive the original publication and schedule a kickoff meeting with the responsible parties. So the authors, the medical writer, the sponsor, any of the involved reviewers, just to make sure we're all aligned on not only the process to create the PLSP, but also on the content that we're going to include in the PLSP. Then drafting begins. So this can not only include the medical writer and the plain language editor, but also in the case with Ian and Joel, where you have a patient author, this would be when they write their portion of the PLSP before we then turn it over to the rest of the authors to provide their feedback on draft one. So I don't know if, Joel, maybe I'll put you on the spot for a second if you want to talk about your experience actually writing a portion of the PLSP. I think that would be beneficial to hear.
Are you, Kim, are you referring to the end pieces that I wrote? Yeah.
Yeah.
So both Ian and I had the opportunity of writing about clinical trials and why they're so important to research. Because I think this is an important end piece. I'm not, honestly, Kim, I mean, I think that was I viewed it more as an adjunct to the piece. It wasn't, part of the summary itself, but I think it was an important piece. I'm not sure if that's where you were looking for.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a significant portion, and I think one that adds a lot of value to the entire document. So yeah, I mean, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, especially, talking about how important research is, and if we are reaching the patients, through these documents, then that certainly is an important addendum to it.
Exactly. So we'll collect all of the author's feedback, revise as needed, pass over a second draft to the editorial panel. As I mentioned, they give us feedback, point out any areas of confusion. We'll revise again based on their feedback and turn over to the authors for a final round of review, make any changes that they suggest, finalize the PLSP to get a final author approved version ready to submit to the target journal. And I will turn it back over to Laura to speak as a representative for journals and publishing on the final steps for publishing here.
Thanks, Kim. Yeah, so I guess I've touched on a few of the points involved in the publication process already, but just to sort of dive into that a little bit more. A really crucial step, as I said, is the peer review of the PLSP. So when we first receive a submission, we'll first do an in-house check, and that's to check just very sort of broadly that the PLSP is an accurate representation of the information in the original publication. And then we send that out for peer review. So we use a variety of people for this. I think there's been a question in the Q&A about how the reviewers are selected. So what we've done is we've established an advisory panel of plain language experts. So, excuse me, experts in plain language writing, patient advocates with an interest in PLS. So we can select peer reviewers from amongst those, or even just reach out to patients that we're able to just source via research, depending on the topic of the article. So we will send the papers out, the PLSP out to those, and they will provide their feedback on all sorts of things. So how understandable it is, any suggestions they've got for improvement. And once we get that feedback, the process is really very similar to the peer review process for our other content. So we'll pass that back to the authors. They will go through making those revisions, resubmit to us, and any back and forth that's needed to get to a final decision on acceptance of the PLSP. And from there, once the PLSP has been accepted, we work with our in-house designers, as you said, Kim, to create the final versions. And how involved this has been quite varied so far with the different projects we've worked on. Some of the authors have very definite ideas and very, sort of requirements on the formatting that they'd like. And some have welcomed a bit more guidance on our side, so help with the creation of graphics and so forth. So we will work with the authors to create that kind of first proof of what it will look like in its formatted form, and ultimately work that through until it goes for final publication online and in the journal. I probably should have mentioned previously, but all of our PLSP articles are of course published open access, so that anyone can read those that want to, and they're also indexed in whichever services the journal is covered by, so PubMed and Web of Science, Google Scholar, the same as the rest of the journal content. So yeah, as I say, I think the crucial part really is that peer review process, to really kind of make sure that what we're providing is answering the need for the audience that's going to be reading it.
Excellent segue into the last part of the process here, which is dissemination, which is also where we're starting to get into the challenges. Now, as a quick time check, we have less than 10 minutes now, about 9 minutes. But we have addressed the questions that have come through for the most part. I will raise those here in a couple of minutes, but we do just want to talk about the dissemination. It's such an important step here and a challenge, really. So we first actually want to hear from Joel, who has some really poignant thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think, thank you for letting me address this. We could write the best article, the best publication in the universe, but if we're not getting it into the hands of our target audience, then we're actually just wasting our time. So we need to find ways to get these publications into patients' hands. And unfortunately, publishing it in a scientific journal, even though it's open access, really doesn't completely resolve this issue, because most patients don't have access to, and they don't have an interest, and they don't know about them, and they don't read the journals. So we need to think and put together a plan that will allow these really important documents to get into the hands of the everyday patient. And I mean, it's going to take some really genius type thinking as to how to do it. I mean, just throw 2 ideas out on the table, and obviously, there's probably a lot more. Can we introduce these into doctors, oncologists' offices on stands so patients could pick up and read it? Can we encourage the doctors to actually have their patients read these documents? Can we reach out to advocacy organizations and get them to support the dissemination to the people who they're dealing with? Those are just 2 thoughts. I'm sure there's a whole lot of other things, but we need to spend some time thinking about how to better distribute these important articles.
Bethtash, the only other thing I would like to include to what Joel just said is that there's much work to be done by the industry to include the patient's voice through the entire process and normalize that for the patient-focused drug development, right? But it's important to have publications that are reviewed by a diverse group of people, especially patients, and make it possible for it to be available to them at any time. There are communities that I work in that are very rare diseases who may not have a patient advocacy group or a strong patient advocate to actually put it forward. So it's really important to have this information readily available and accessible through general sources.
Vector through which PLSP can help us be more patient-centric, engage with patient communities, particularly where they don't have an existing channel or framework. Laura, to the point of getting this out to folks, maybe in different ways, can you talk about supporting communications and what you folks are doing there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as Joel mentioned, I totally agree. Patients aren't naturally going to be looking at peer-reviewed journals. I'm sure they're not looking things up on PubMed necessarily. So that's why we really try and maximize our use of things like social media to spread the word when these pieces are published. So just as an example, all of our journals have active Twitter accounts, LinkedIn groups, things like that. And we'll try and identify appropriate hashtags. We'll use images and animations where we've got them when we share to really boost attention of the content. And we'll also look to try and identify any relevant patient advocacy organisations for whatever topic the article is on and reach out to them to let them know about the publication, mention them in tweets, all those sorts of things. And one of the great things about the standalone PLSPs in particular is that we can really track a lot of metrics on their impact from our website. So we can look at quite simple things like the number of downloads, but obviously that doesn't actually tell us who's downloading. So we have a tool that we use called Altmetrics that's freely available to view alongside the articles. And that shows us information on where and how the PLSPs have been shared. So it's been really interesting so far to see who's been tweeting them, retweeting them, whether they're featured on any kind of news sites or blogs, and also even when they've been cited in subsequent publications. And the Twitter information in particular is quite interesting because it tells us who's been tweeting them, where they are in the world, which is interesting, and even some details on demographics, which has been really encouraging because we've seen quite a high proportion. Generally speaking, more than half of the tweets and the retweets are coming from members of the public, as opposed to sort of clinicians or researchers. So obviously it's not an exact science sort of identifying people on the internet, but from what we can see so far, it looks like that the content is reaching people in that social media platform, which is really great to see. So something we're going to be watching closely, I think.
Really great insight there. I'm sure folks were curious about, the role of social media in this and how do you, actually measure the impact. So what we're going to do here very quickly, we'll move to our last slide here, where we're going to pass it over to Yuan to quickly give us an overview of some of the challenges here. This may address the two questions that we have, but I do want to just ask that we leave 2 minutes here to address two questions that have been posed. And in the meantime, if we can launch that final poll, that will be good as well. But Yuan, please walk us through some of these high-level challenges that there exist.
Yeah, thank you, Patash. Yeah, so just to close and really share the challenges from our experience working on the plain language summary publications. As shown on the slide here, one thing is the lack of inconsistency in the format requirement and made that available to the patients. So we have really researched this and explored the opportunity working with Future Oncology as a publisher. And with this close collaboration, we're able to figure out a lot of these solutions to overcome the barrier. The other challenge here is the recognition of the value of the PLSP to advance patient care, how we can align internally with our cross-functional teams and also show the patients that we really want to target what the value of these PLSP is to them, what information would be most critical for them to have access to and to be able to get a grasp on the understanding of it. So this is something that's quite challenging to gain that alignment. And the third challenge here is the lack of guidelines on the standardizing authorship and how to incorporate patient perspectives as the addendum to the PLSP. So even though it's a direct translation from the original article, but we do see the value of including the patient perspectives from our patient authors and what they say about the clinical trial results, how valuable and how they can use that in communication with the patients. So hopefully in the future, there will be more guidance on how to standardize that. And lastly, the challenge here is really finding the tools and the resources. So as Laura had spoken to, they're the first and probably the only publisher right now that we have found and had the pleasure of working with, and they have offered a lot of the resources that they have, such as the dissemination once our paper is published, how to use their digital enhancement options and the social media channels to disseminate that. So these are all things that we want to look into in the future to maximize the outreach and the education to our target audience. So I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuan. And as the poll results are shown here, you can see everybody here who is a presenter. You can reach out to any of us. We'd be very happy to hear from you. Obviously, sharing our experiences thus far. But again, recapping on that point that Yuan mentioned, emerging area. The standards are certainly not universal, and the guidance is sparse. There is guidance on plain language summary development in general, but that's not specific to PLS. So keep that in mind. Two questions that we had as we finish up here. I'll let folks go through the poll results themselves. One question was, I'm curious why PLSP are limited to secondary version of a single article. Essentially, why can't it synthesize research from multiple original articles? I hope that I'm not speaking out of line here when I say it can summarize several articles. And so I'll let somebody else comment on that, but maybe follow on to this question. Why can't patient advocacy organizations select fund managed standalone PLSP? I mean, it's an interesting question because essentially, outside of the publication step, this is what patient advocacy organizations have been doing for decades. Taking research results and conveying it in an understandable manner to their patient group. So who among our speakers would love to raise their hand and address one or both of those points?
I guess just speaking to the point about whether it can be on more than one original publication, as you said, Betash, I see no reason why not. It's something that people have asked us about, whether, for example, we publish a PLSP of maybe a cluster of trials. That's something that there's been interest in, and something certainly we would be happy to pursue with people if they wanted to. I think, again, it's a sort of a natural next step.
And I suppose, from the patient, oh yes, please go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah. I would also like to add to that. There are a lot of expert opinion review articles that summarize a collection of trials and put their expert perspectives on those reviews. So those could be potential publications that we can look to translate and have an integrated information for patients.
So I do want to offer, any one of our panelists, any one of our speakers today, any final words that you might want to share?
I think it's important to have a set of criteria that you always use, so there's a way to go back to. And it's important for patients all to receive this with every trial. Although it's mandated in Europe, it needs to happen for all trials.
So there will be a follow-up survey here to assess, how we did today. And that might include a question, about how folks would like to be involved in helping to, think about those standards at least. So from everyone here, thank you so much to the panelists, and thank you to the attendees. We do hope that this was a very insightful and helpful session. It will be made available thereafter as the recording. And again, thank you.